In the heart of the American Southwest, beneath the endless blue skies and the quiet rustle of orchard leaves, a mother's whispered prayers echo across the years. 30 years ago, her 3 identical sons vanished without a trace, leaving only a photograph and an unyielding ache in her heart. Decades later, a chance glimpse of a familiar face and the flash of a long-forgotten Cadillac ignites a journey that will uncover buried secrets and unearth the hidden truths of a lifetime. This is not just the story of a disappearance. It is the story of a family's unwavering love, of memory and mystery, and of the fierce light that refuses to die, even in the darkest of nights. Stay with us as we unfold a saga of stolen childhoods, relentless hope, and the quiet triumph of a mother's unbreakable bond. The sun hung heavy in the sky over Silver Creek, New Mexico, that late afternoon, its golden rays flickering through the cottonwood trees that lined the quiet streets of the small, dusty town. It was a Saturday, one of those days when life seemed to slow to a lazy crawl, and neighbors would gather in backyards to share laughter and stories, to watch children chase each other across lawns still damp with morning dew. In the Rodriguez family's modest yard, a birthday party was underway, a bright patchwork of balloons and laughter, and the sweet scent of barbecued ribs wafting through the air. Maggie Sanders adjusted the brim of her straw hat as she stood near the edge of the patio, her gaze drifting from group to group. She'd been invited at the last minute by her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who insisted that Maggie needed a day out, a chance to leave behind the dusty boxes of memories she'd spent decades avoiding. At 60, Maggie moved with a quiet elegance, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her green eyes lined with the fine etchings of time and the deep grief that never truly left her. She had long ago learned how to carry that pain with grace, though today it felt particularly raw, a dull ache she tried to ignore. George, her husband of 40 years, was at the grill with the other men, sharing stories about old cars and how the town had changed. He was a gentle giant of a man, his shoulders stooped slightly now, but his presence always a comfort. Maggie smiled faintly at the sound of his laughter mixing with the children's shrieks as they played tag across the yard. She tried to lose herself in the scene, to let the warmth of the sun and the easy rhythm of small talk drown out the ever-present echo of absence that lived in her heart. She was listening to her neighbor Martha's enthusiastic tale of her flourishing garden when movement at the patio door caught her eye. A man she didn't recognize stepped into the backyard, his hand wrapped gently around the wrist of a boy no older than 8. "Sorry we're late," the man said, his tone light, almost apologetic, as though he had wandered in from another life. "Something came up at home." The boy immediately pulled away, darting into the swirl of children, his small figure a blur of energy and laughter. Maggie's eyes followed him, something inside her tightening, a sudden flicker of recognition that made her breath catch. The boy was wearing green checkered overalls with bright yellow straps, the fabric vibrant against his long-sleeved white shirt. Dark curly hair bounced as he ran, and for a moment, Maggie felt the world shift, a dizzying tilt that left her heart pounding in her chest. She knew those clothes. She knew them in the way a mother knows the scent of her child's hair, the way she knows the weight of her child's head against her shoulder in the dark of night. Those overalls, green and yellow, a pattern burned into her memory, had belonged to her sons, Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel, her triplets. 30 years ago, those boys had vanished while playing in the yard of their small house down the block, gone in the space of an afternoon, the world forever split into before and after. Maggie's hand lifted of its own accord, reaching out as though she could pluck the boy from the swirl of children and pull him back to her, back to the safety she had failed to give. She crossed the yard in a few long strides, her breath ragged, the chatter of the party fading to a distant hum in her ears. She reached out, her fingers brushing the boy's shoulder. "Where did you get those clothes?" she asked, her voice hoarse, almost a whisper, but the words fell like stones in the hush of her mind. The boy turned, his eyes wide with confusion, alarm flashing across his face. He pulled away, stumbling back into the circle of children. "Daddy! Daddy!" he cried out, his voice high with fear. The man, his father presumably, looked up, his expression shifting from polite amusement to concern as he moved toward Maggie. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his hand settling protectively on his son's shoulder, his posture firm yet gentle. Maggie stood frozen, her fingers trembling inches from the boy's shirt. "Those overalls, where did you get them?" she managed, her voice shaking like the brittle leaves of autumn. The man's brow furrowed, his body tensing in a subtle but unmistakable way. "Excuse me," he said, his tone edging toward caution. "What's your problem, lady?" Around them, the party's easy chatter stuttered into an uneasy silence, heads turning, eyes narrowing in curiosity. George was at her side in an instant, his hand warm and solid on her back. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, his voice calm, though Maggie could feel the tremor in his fingertips. "My wife didn't mean to startle your boy. It's just his outfit. It's very similar to what our sons used to wear." The man's eyes softened slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Your sons?" he echoed. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as George spoke the words she could not. "Our boys. They were triplets. They disappeared 30 years ago," George said softly, his voice cracking on the words. "They had green checkered overalls, just like that, with yellow straps." A murmur swept through the small crowd as memories were stirred, sympathy flickering in the eyes of neighbors who remembered the endless days of searching, the flyers stapled to telephone poles, the candlelight vigils that guttered out one by one. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on the man's arm. "It's true," she said quietly. "The Sanders triplets disappeared in 1981, a terrible, terrible loss. We all searched for them." The man's gaze shifted back to Maggie, his expression now edged with compassion. "I had no idea," he said softly. "I'm so sorry. I bought these clothes months ago at a department store. I can't remember exactly when." Maggie's fingers hovered over the boy's overalls, her heart breaking anew. "Please," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "Could I just look at them, just to see if they are the same brand?" George's hand tightened on her shoulder. "Maggie, honey, let it go," he murmured. "It's not them. Let's not frighten the boy anymore." The man shifted, his hand firm on his son's back. "We're new to the neighborhood," he said gently. "We thought coming to this party would help us meet everyone." George offered a sad smile, nodding. "It's not your fault," he said. "We're sorry for the confusion. It's been difficult for us." Maggie felt the weight of 100 eyes, the pity and the discomfort and the relief that it was not their tragedy to carry. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward again, her touch gentle on Maggie's arm. "You look pale, dear," she said softly. "Perhaps you should go home and rest." George nodded gratefully, guiding Maggie away from the curious eyes, her mind spinning with memories she had long tried to bury. They walked the 3 blocks home in silence, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. Once inside, George helped her to the sofa, his movements tender, practiced. He made her a cup of tea, the steam curling into the warm air, but when he pressed it into her hands, she only stared at it, the memories crowding in. "I didn't mean to scare that little boy," she said, her voice breaking. When I saw those clothes—" "I know," George said quietly, sitting beside her, his hand finding hers. "I know. I can't forget them, George," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Even after all these years, I see them in every child's face." George closed his eyes, his fingers tightening around hers. "They would be men now," he said softly. "All 3 of them." "I know," Maggie said, her voice a breath of air. "But in my heart, they're still my little boys." She sat up a little straighter, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I want to see their pictures again, George," she said, her voice steadier now. "The ones where they're wearing those overalls." George hesitated, his jaw working. "They're in the attic," he said finally. "We haven't opened that box in 20 years. Please," she said softly, "if it will help me calm down." He sighed, rising from the sofa and disappearing up the narrow staircase. She listened to the creak of the attic ladder, the rustle of old boxes, and then he was back, carrying a dusty cardboard box in his arms, the weight of it bending his shoulders. He set it on the coffee table and wiped the dust away with a kitchen towel. Together, they opened the lid, the scent of old paper and worn cloth rising to meet them. Maggie's fingers trembled as she lifted small toys, faded homework assignments, and 3 identical stuffed bears with missing eyes and threadbare ears. Each item was a fragment of a childhood stolen away, a memory frozen in time. "The photo album should be at the bottom," George said, his voice thick with emotion. They dug through the layers of memories until they found it. A leather-bound album, its cover smooth and worn from years of handling. They sat side by side on the sofa as George opened the album, the first pages filled with the bright beginnings of life. 3 identical infants in the hospital nursery, their tiny fists clenched, their eyes bright with the promise of tomorrow. Maggie traced her finger over each photograph, her breath catching in her throat as she whispered their names. Lucas, Noah, Gabriel. The images flipped past, the boys toddling across the lawn in matching sun hats, building sandcastles at the beach, their laughter forever silent on the page. Then they found the photograph, the one that had haunted her dreams for decades, the triplets standing in front of their small house, arms draped over each other's shoulders, grinning in those green checkered overalls with the yellow straps. "This was taken the morning they disappeared," George said softly. Just an hour before they were gone. Maggie leaned closer, studying every inch of the image. "Look," she said suddenly, her voice urgent. "The Cadillac, in the background." George squinted, his breath catching. "You're right," he said slowly. "That's Raymond Clark's Cadillac. The boys used to beg him to show them the inside." "But he left town before they disappeared," Maggie said, her brow furrowing. "He told everyone he was moving away." "Maybe it's a coincidence," George suggested, though doubt flickered in his eyes. "Maybe it belonged to someone else." "No," Maggie said firmly. "We knew everyone in the neighborhood. No one else had a car like that." George took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "The police saw these pictures, Maggie. They questioned everyone. If it had been Raymond's car, they would have known." Maggie closed her eyes, her mind spinning. "I have to find out, George. I have to know if it was him." "We don't want to chase ghosts, Maggie," George said gently. "We've lived with this pain long enough." But Maggie shook her head, her jaw set with a determination that had carried her through 3 decades of quiet grief. "No more ghosts," she said softly. "Just the truth." Maggie's fingers tightened around the edges of the leather-bound photo album as she and George sat there in silence, the weight of the past pressing down on them like the humid New Mexico air that seeped through the thin curtains. And even as they left the house the next morning in George's old sedan, the photograph of their sons, Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel, lingered in Maggie's mind, each smiling face a haunting echo of what had been stolen from them so long ago. And as they drove down the winding roads leading away from the town of Silver Creek, passing fields of wildflowers that seemed to sway in sympathy with Maggie's turbulent heart, she couldn't help but feel the pull of fate guiding them towards something both terrifying and inevitable, because the truth was that she had always known the day would come when the past would refuse to stay buried, and as they arrived at Raymond's Sanctuary for Children, the sign itself seemed to tremble in the gentle breeze. The words, "A place of hope and healing," painted carefully yet unable to hide the weight of all it had seen. And Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she saw children playing near the barn, their laughter a bittersweet melody that pulled at the deepest parts of her soul. And when Ethan appeared, his curly black hair and easy smile striking a chord so deep within her that she had to steady herself against the car door, she forced herself to smile in return, though her voice trembled as she asked if they could look around. And Ethan, ever the gracious host, led them through the farm with a warmth that belied the darkness Maggie sensed lurking just beneath the surface. His every word painting a picture of kindness and care, yet every detail only making the similarities more striking. The way his smile curved up on one side, the way his dark eyes seemed to sparkle with the same mischievous light she remembered so vividly in her sons, and when she asked him if he had brothers, the world seemed to tilt around her as he nodded slowly. His admission that he was one of 3 triplets sending a shiver down her spine that no summer sun could chase away. And as they reached the brightly painted barn, covered in the artwork of children whose lives had been touched by the man who had become a shadow in their own lives, Maggie felt her hands tremble as she reached out to steady herself, and Ethan's voice, so gentle and earnest, spoke of how Mr. Clark had saved him and his brothers from a life of uncertainty. But Maggie's mind was already racing, the name Ethan echoing alongside Lucas, the name Daniel whispering alongside Noah, and the name Micah, spoken softly by Ethan, wrapping around Gabriel's memory like a warm, desperate plea. And as George stood beside her, his hand a steady weight on her shoulder, she knew that they were standing on the edge of something that would change everything. And when Ethan offered to show them more, She found herself nodding, though her thoughts were a whirlwind of memories and questions, and every step they took deeper into the sanctuary felt like a journey back in time. Each corner of the farm, a reflection of the dreams and fears she had carried in her heart for 30 years. And though Ethan's words were calm, Maggie could hear the unspoken truths in the spaces between them, could feel the weight of secrets that pressed down on them, like the New Mexico sun overhead. And when they finally left the sanctuary, Ethan's kind eyes lingering on them, with a mixture of curiosity and something like recognition, Maggie knew that she could not rest until she saw Mr. Clark himself, until she looked into his eyes and saw the truth that had eluded her for so long. And as they drove away, the photograph of her sons resting in her lap, the image of Ethan's face superimposed over the memories of Lucas's smile, she knew that they were closer than ever to finding the answers they had sought for so many years. And as the road stretched out ahead of them, winding through the dusty fields and the quiet whispers of the past, Maggie's heart beat with a fierce, unyielding hope that this time, finally, the truth would not be denied. And as they turned onto the old country road leading to the county fairgrounds, where Ethan had said Raymond would be, Maggie felt her pulse quicken, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts, the weight of 3 decades pressing down on her shoulders and yet lifting her at the same time, because she could feel it now, the nearness of resolution, the echo of her son's laughter that had been silenced too soon. And she knew that no matter what they found at the end of that road, they would face it together, because love had never left her. It had only waited, patient and fierce, for the day when the truth would rise and set them free. As the county fairgrounds came into view, the vibrant colors of the tents and the gentle hum of laughter and music drifting through the late afternoon air seemed almost surreal to Maggie, each sight and sound a jarring contrast to the storm raging in her heart. And as George guided the car into the gravel lot, she tightened her grip on the photograph in her lap, her knuckles white with the force of her resolve, because she knew that beyond the laughter and the bright banners lay the answer she had been chasing for 30 years. And as they stepped out into the dusty heat, the scent of kettle corn and hay bales mingling with the faint tang of engine oil from the farm equipment displays, Maggie's eyes swept across the bustling crowd, searching for a familiar silhouette among the strangers, her breath catching when she finally saw him standing near a white tent, adorned with a simple banner that read, "Raymond's Sanctuary for Children." His hair now white as the clouds above, but his posture still straight, his gestures animated as he spoke to a couple who looked like donors, and for a moment Maggie felt the years fall away. The image of Mr. Clark, Raymond Clark, standing at the head of her son's first-grade classroom, his warm smile and soft-spoken words weaving a spell of trust and comfort that had once seemed so genuine. And as she watched him now, his hands moving in the same careful way she remembered, she felt a chill run down her spine, because the man she had trusted with her children's laughter was the same man whose car had appeared in the background of the photograph that had haunted her dreams for decades. And as she waited for the couple to leave, George's hand found hers, grounding her in the moment as he whispered softly, "We'll face this together." And she nodded, swallowing hard as they stepped forward, their footsteps crunching on the gravel like the final notes of a song long left unfinished. And when they stood before him, close enough to see the fine lines etched around his eyes, Raymond turned to them, his polite smile faltering for just a heartbeat as recognition flickered in his gaze. And Maggie's voice, though trembling, was strong as she spoke. "Mr. Clark, it's been a long time." And Raymond blinked, his expression settling into that familiar mask of genial warmth as he said, "I'm sorry, I don't believe we've met." But Maggie's fingers tightened around the photograph, her heart thundering in her chest as she lifted it between them, the image of 3 little boys in green checkered overalls bridging the gulf of years. And for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath as Raymond's eyes fell on the photo, his smile vanishing like mist in the sun as the carefully constructed facade cracked. And though his lips parted as if to speak, no words came, only a flicker of something. Fear, maybe, or the final unraveling of a secret too long held. And Maggie took a step closer, her voice low and urgent as she said, "This was taken the day my sons disappeared, and your car was there, Mr. Clark." And George's presence beside her was a silent wall of strength as she held Raymond's gaze, refusing to let him look away, because she needed to see the truth in his eyes, needed to know if the man who had once seemed so kind had stolen more than her children's trust that day. And as Raymond's shoulders stiffened, his fingers curling into tight fists at his sides, he said softly. "I can't remember. I don't recall that day." But the lie tasted bitter in the air between them, and Maggie felt the chill of certainty settle over her heart. Because even as the fair continued around them, the music and laughter, a distant echo, she knew that she had found the missing piece of a puzzle that had never stopped haunting her. And, as Raymond turned away, his voice a hollow echo of politeness as he excused himself to see to his duties, Maggie's eyes narrowed, her breath steady as she watched him walk away. The photograph clutched tightly in her hand, like a talisman, against the darkness she could feel pressing in around them, and George leaned close, his voice a low murmur in her ear. "We're not letting this go, Maggie." And she nodded, her eyes never leaving the retreating figure of the man who had stolen her son's laughter, because she knew now that the truth was within reach, and she would not rest until she held it in her hands. As Maggie watched Raymond disappear into the crowd, his white hair catching the light like a ghostly beacon, she felt her resolve harden into something almost tangible. A cold, clear flame that burned away the doubt and fear she had carried for so many years. And as George placed a steadying hand on her arm, she turned to him, her voice low and urgent as she said, "We have to find out what he's hiding, George. We can't let this end here." And he nodded, his jaw tight with the same quiet determination she saw reflected in her own eyes. So they moved together through the fair, weaving between families and farmers and children, clutching sticky cones of cotton candy, their senses tuned not to the bright laughter or the scent of fried dough, but to the invisible thread that tied them to the man who had stolen so much from them. And as they reached the edge of the vendor area, Maggie spotted a small white tent with a blue banner that read, "Raymond's Sanctuary for Children," and beneath it, young volunteers were packing up pamphlets and folding tables, their movements efficient and practiced. But Maggie's gaze fell on one of the young men, a figure with thick curly black hair and a smile that was both warm and unsettling in its familiarity. And her breath caught in her throat because she knew that smile, had seen it 1,000 times in old photographs and in dreams that always ended in tears. And as she stepped closer, her voice was calm, but her heart was pounding like a war drum in her chest. And she asked softly, "Excuse me, do you know where Mr. Clark went?" And the young man looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers with a flicker of recognition that sent a shiver down her spine, and he said, "He had to leave early, ma'am, but he'll be back at the farm later this evening." And though his words were polite, there was something guarded in his tone, a careful distance that spoke of rehearsed stories and hidden truths. And Maggie swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the photograph she still clutched like a lifeline, because she could see it now, the same smile, the same hair, the same quiet strength that had lived in Lucas and Noah and Gabriel. And she knew without question that she was looking at one of her sons, grown into a man she had never had the chance to know. And she took a breath, steadying her voice as she asked, "What's your name?" And he hesitated just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before he said, "Ethan, ma'am." And the name fell into the space between them, like a stone in still water, ripples of recognition and heartbreak spreading out to fill the silence. And Maggie nodded slowly, her throat tight with unshed tears as she said, "Ethan, that's a good name." But inside, her mind was racing, the echoes of memory and the weight of years colliding in a single, blinding moment of clarity. Because she knew that Ethan was Lucas, and that the truth was closer than it had ever been. And as George stepped up beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, she felt the strength of their shared purpose, the unspoken vow that they would not let the past be buried any longer, and with a calm she did not feel. Maggie thanked Ethan and turned away, her heart pounding in her chest as she whispered to George, "We have to go back to the farm. We have to find the others. We have to bring them home." And he nodded, his jaw set, and together they walked back to the car, the photograph of their lost boys pressed between them like a promise. The road ahead no longer a winding path of uncertainty, but a straight line into the heart of the truth they had been denied for far too long. As Maggie and George drove away from the fairgrounds, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the winding country road, the world outside the car seemed to blur and fade, replaced by the relentless pulse of Maggie's thoughts, each beat echoing with the names of the sons she had never stopped loving. And though George kept his eyes on the road, his hand resting on hers with a silent strength, she knew that he too was lost in the labyrinth of memory, each mile bringing them closer, not just to the sanctuary that Raymond had built, but to the truth that had been stolen from them so many years ago. And when the wooden sign for Raymond's sanctuary for children finally came into view, Maggie felt her breath catch, her fingers tightening around the photograph she held like a shield. Because this place, so quiet and green and filled with the laughter of children, was also a place where her sons had lived lives she had never seen. And as they pulled into the gravel drive, the air was heavy with the scent of hay and summer heat, and Maggie's eyes scanned the quiet buildings, searching for any sign of the man who had once been their teacher, the man who had become their captor. And as they stepped from the car, the weight of the years pressed down on her shoulders, but she lifted her head high, her resolve a bright flame that would not be extinguished, and together they walked toward the main house, their footsteps slow and steady, each one a defiance of the years of silence and pain. And when they reached the porch, Maggie paused, her hand resting on the weathered wood of the railing, as she took a breath, the air tasting of dust and old dreams, and she knocked, the sound sharp in the stillness. And a moment later, the door opened, and there he was, Raymond Clark, his white hair catching the last light of the day, his eyes widening just a fraction as he saw them standing there. And Maggie saw the flicker of surprise, the quick calculation behind his polite smile, and she stepped forward, her voice steady as she said, "Mr. Clark, we need to speak with you." And though he hesitated, his lips parting as if to protest, he stepped aside, gesturing them in with that same soft-spoken charm that had once won the trust of her sons. And as they entered the house, the air cool and dim after the bright glare of the porch, Maggie felt her heart thud against her ribs, her fingers still wrapped around the photograph that had become her talisman, her proof that the past was not gone, but merely hidden, waiting to be unearthed. And as Raymond led them into a small sitting room, the walls lined with photographs of children laughing in fields of wildflowers, Maggie's eyes flickered over each frame, searching for the familiar curve of a smile, the glint of dark curls. And though the faces were all different, she could feel the ghosts of her sons in every shadow. And Raymond turned to them, his expression calm, but the tension in his shoulders betraying the storm beneath, and he said, "I wasn't expecting visitors this evening." But Maggie shook her head, her voice quiet and sure as she said, "We've waited 30 years for this, Mr. Clark, and we're not leaving until we have answers." And as the last light of day slipped below the horizon, the room seemed to close in around them, the air charged with the weight of unspoken truths. And Maggie lifted the photograph between them, her eyes never leaving his as she said, "We know what you did, and we're here to bring our boys home." And in that moment, as the shadows deepened and the night pressed close, the first crack appeared in the mask of Raymond's smile, a flicker of something, fear, or perhaps the weary weight of a secret that had grown too heavy to bear. And Maggie knew that whatever came next, the truth was closer than it had ever been. As the dust settled in and the first stars blinked to life in the velvet sky above the New Mexico plains, the quiet room where they sat seemed to shrink, the walls pressing closer with every breath. And Maggie's voice was the only sound that mattered as she held the photograph between them, like a blade of truth, her hand trembling only slightly as she said again, "We know, Raymond, and we're not leaving until you tell us everything." And Raymond's eyes, once warm and welcoming, darkened with something ancient and haunted, the flicker of a man who had lived too long with the weight of stolen lives. And for a moment he said nothing. The silence thick around them, broken only by the faint chirp of crickets outside the window and the steady, unwavering breath of George at Maggie's side. And then Raymond sat back in his chair, his hands folding in his lap with a careful precision, and he said softly, "I suppose it was only a matter of time," his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had built his own prison from the bones of his lies. And Maggie felt her heart stutter in her chest, because she knew then that the moment she had dreamed of and dreaded had finally come. And Raymond's words spilled out into the dim light like a confession, quiet and methodical, each syllable etching itself into the air as he spoke of the day 30 years ago, when he had seen her boys playing in the yard, their laughter a siren song, to a man who had lost everything and convinced himself that the only way to fill the void in his heart was to steal the light of another. And he spoke of how he had offered them ice cream, how they had climbed eagerly into his Cadillac, their trust as fragile and bright as the morning sun, and how he had driven away from the neighborhood with their small voices singing along to the radio, a chorus of innocence that would never reach home again. And Maggie listened, her breath caught in her throat, each word a knife that cut deeper even as it laid bare the truth she had always known in her bones. And George's hand on her back was the only thing that kept her grounded, his quiet strength a reminder that they had survived the years of empty birthdays and hollow holidays, that they had survived the silence and the doubt and the endless nights of grief, and now, at last, they had the answers that would set them free. And Raymond's voice faltered as he spoke of how he had raised the boys as his own, how he had told them their parents were gone, how he had woven a story of rescue and sanctuary from the threads of his own guilt and longing. And as his voice trailed off into the silence, Maggie felt the tears spill over, not from the shock of betrayal, because that was an old wound that had long since scarred, but from the raw, searing relief of finally hearing the words that would bring her sons back to her. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet but filled with the unyielding strength of a mother who had never stopped searching. "Where are they now, Raymond?" And he hesitated, his eyes flickering to the window, as if the darkness beyond might swallow him whole. And he said, "They're here, Maggie. They've always been here, living as Ethan, Daniel, and Micah." And the names fell into the room like thunder, each one a piece of her heart she thought she had lost. And she rose from her chair, her breath catching as she said, "I want to see them. I need to see them." And Raymond nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as he whispered, "They're at the dormitory down by the orchard. They'll be coming back soon." And Maggie turned to George, her eyes bright with tears and a fierce light that would not be dimmed, and together they stepped out into the night, the cool air washing over them like a blessing. The sky above wide and endless and filled with stars that seemed to watch with silent approval as they walked toward the orchard, each step a reclamation of the years that had been stolen, and as they reached the path lined with apple trees heavy with the scent of summer fruit, Maggie could hear the soft murmur of voices ahead, and she knew, without a doubt, that the moment she had waited for was finally within reach. Maggie's heart was pounding so hard she could almost hear the blood rushing in her ears as she and George walked hand in hand down the narrow path that led toward the orchard, the air cool and heavy with the sweet scent of ripening apples that hung in the summer dusk like a promise of redemption. And every step she took felt like moving closer to the children she had carried in her womb and in her heart every single day of those 30 endless years, because no matter how many birthdays she had spent alone, no matter how many nights she had lain awake staring at the moon and whispering their names into the darkness, she had never stopped believing that one day she would see them again. And now, as the soft glow of the orchard lights came into view, strung like tiny stars through the twisting branches, she felt the weight of all those years lift just a little, replaced by a fragile, trembling hope that made her breath catch in her throat. And George squeezed her hand, his own eyes bright with tears that he would never let fall in front of her, because he had always been her anchor, the steady presence that kept her from drifting into the dark waters of despair. And as they reached the edge of the orchard, Maggie saw 3 figures standing together beneath the dappled light, their heads bent in quiet conversation. And she stopped, her breath catching as she took in the broad shoulders, the dark curls that caught the light just so, the way one of them gestured with a hand that moved exactly like Lucas used to when he was trying to explain something to his brothers. And though they were men now, tall and strong and weathered by the years they had spent apart, in that moment Maggie saw her little boys standing there, the same mischievous tilt of the head, the same spark of laughter that had once filled their small house with light. And she took a step forward, her voice trembling as she called out, "Lucas, Noah, Gabriel," and the 3 men turned toward her, their faces shadowed by the leaves, but the shock and recognition clear in their eyes, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. The air between them thick with the weight of everything that had been lost and everything that had been found. And then the man she knew in her soul was Lucas took a step forward, his lips parting as he whispered, "Mother?" And Maggie let out a sob that was half laughter, half grief, her knees nearly buckling as she rushed toward him, and he caught her in his arms, holding her close as if he would never let her go again. And she buried her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of him, the warm, living scent of her son who had been lost and was now found. And George was there too, his arms around them both, his voice choked with tears as he said, our boys are home." And then Noah and Gabriel were there too, their hands reaching for her, their voices trembling with the weight of the years and the love that had never died. And for a long moment they stood there beneath the orchard lights, a family once more, bound together not by time or distance or even memory, but by the unbreakable threads of blood and love and the fierce, unyielding hope that had carried them all through the darkness. and as they pulled back to look at each other, Maggie saw the lines of pain and survival etched into their faces, the shadows of the lies they had been told, and the quiet strength that had allowed them to endure. And she cupped Lucas's cheek in her hand, her thumb brushing away a tear as she said, "I never stopped looking for you." And he closed his eyes, his hand covering hers as he whispered, "We never stopped hoping you'd find us." And though there were still so many questions, so many years to be filled with the stories they had lost, in that moment, all that mattered was that they were together, that the long night of grief had finally given way to the dawn of something new and bright and filled with the promise of healing. And as they walked back toward the farmhouse, their arms around each other, Maggie felt the old pain begin to loosen its grip, replaced by the warmth of her son's laughter and the steady, comforting presence of George at her side. And though she knew there would be hard days ahead, days when the memories of what had been taken would rise up like ghosts to haunt them all, she also knew that they would face them together, because family was not just the bonds of blood, but the fierce determination to never let those bonds be broken again. And as the lights of the sanctuary glowed in the distance, Maggie felt the first stirrings of peace in her heart, the quiet certainty that the past could never again steal what she held now in her arms. And she lifted her face to the night sky, the stars above a silent chorus of witness to the miracle that had brought her family back to her. And in that infinite expanse of darkness and light, she found the strength to believe that no matter how deep the shadows, the love that bound them would always be stronger, shining brighter than any darkness could ever hope to swallow. As they walked slowly back toward the farmhouse, Maggie's hand resting lightly on Lucas's arm, she could feel the unspoken weight of everything that lay between them, not just the years they had lost, but the quiet scars that each of her sons carried in the way they held themselves, the careful way they measured their words. And she knew that though this night was a beginning, it was also a reckoning, because love could not erase the memories of the years they had spent apart, the lies they had been told. And the slow, patient work of healing would take more than a single night of reunion under the stars. And as they stepped onto the porch, the soft creak of the wooden boards beneath their feet felt like a familiar heartbeat, a gentle reminder of the home she had once dreamed of, and the home they would now have to build together, piece by fragile piece. And Raymond was there in the doorway, his shoulders hunched, his eyes shadowed by a regret that even now could not erase the harm he had done. And for a moment, the silence between them was a living thing, thick and heavy. And then Lucas spoke, his voice low but firm as he said, "We need to hear the truth, Raymond, all of it." And the old man nodded slowly, his hands twisting together like a penitent in prayer. And he led them inside, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows across the worn floorboards as he began to speak, his words weaving a tapestry of sorrow and justification that only deepened the ache in Maggie's chest. Because though she could hear the pain in his voice, the quiet desperation of a man who had convinced himself that he was saving those boys instead of stealing them, she also knew that nothing he said could ever make right the years they had lost. And when he finished, his voice trailing off into a silence that seemed to swallow the room whole, Maggie reached across the table, her fingers brushing the photograph she had carried like a talisman, and she said, "You cannot undo what you have done, Raymond, but you can help us heal, by telling the whole truth to the authorities, by giving us the names and the stories of the other children you took in, by making sure no one else is left in the dark." And for a moment, Raymond just looked at her, the lines of his face deep with age and weariness. And then he nodded, a single shuddering breath leaving his lips as he whispered, "I will." And though Maggie knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with questions that might never have answers, she also knew that this was a beginning, the first fragile step toward a kind of justice that had been denied for far too long. And as they rose from the table, Lucas reached for her hand, his fingers strong and warm around hers, and he said softly, "We're here now, Mom. We're here, and we're not going anywhere." Ivora, and though the tears that filled her eyes were born of a sorrow that would never fully leave her, they were also tears of relief, of love that had survived the long night of separation. And as they stepped out into the cool night air once more, the moon a silver witness to the quiet vows they made in the darkness, Maggie felt a small, fierce flame of hope flicker to life in her chest, a fragile but unbreakable promise that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. And that was enough for now. As dawn crept over the rolling fields of New Mexico, bathing the orchard in soft hues of pink and gold, Maggie sat on the edge of the farmhouse porch, the the photograph of her boys cradled in her hands, as if she could somehow gather up the pieces of their stolen childhood and knit them back together again. And George stood beside her, his quiet presence a steady balm to the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. Because though the night had brought them the truth they had been searching for, it had also opened wounds that would take more than the gentle warmth of the morning sun to heal. And in the kitchen behind her, she could hear the low murmur of Raymond's voice as he spoke with the authorities, the calm, measured cadence of a man who had finally chosen to lay down his burden of lies and face the consequences of the choices he had made so many years ago. And though a part of her still burned with the fury of a mother who had been denied her sons, another part of her, a part she hadn't known existed, felt an almost weary relief that the cycle of silence and secrecy was finally being broken. And as she turned to look at Lucas, who sat beside his brothers on the worn steps, his head bent over a mug of coffee, she felt her heart clench at the quiet strength in his posture, the way he carried the weight of 3 decades as if it were nothing more than another scar to be worn with pride. And she reached out, her fingers brushing the back of his hand, a silent reminder that he was not alone, that he would never be alone again. And when he looked up, his eyes met hers with a fierce, steady light that made her breath catch, and he said softly, "We'll be okay, Mom. We'll figure this out, one step at a time." And though she knew that there were still so many questions left unanswered, about the years they had spent hidden away, about the other children who had come and gone through the doors of Raymond's sanctuary, she also knew that the only way forward was to let those questions breathe in the light, to refuse to let them fester in the shadows any longer. And so she nodded, her throat tight with all the things she wanted to say but could not find the words for. And together they watched as the sheriff's car pulled up the long dirt drive, the dust of the road swirling around its tires like a final testament to the secrets it was coming to uncover. And as Raymond stepped out of the house, his shoulders stooped but his head held high, Maggie felt the sharp sting of memory, the way he had once smiled at her sons in the bright classrooms of Silver Creek Elementary, the way that smile had masked the darkness beneath. And she stood as he approached, her heart a quiet drumbeat of forgiveness she did not yet feel but knew she would have to find, because though justice was the work of the law, healing was the work of the heart. And when Raymond paused before her, his eyes shadowed by the weight of what he had done, she met his gaze without flinching, her voice calm as she said, "Tell them everything, Raymond. Don't hold anything back." And he nodded, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came, only a single tear that traced the lines of his face like a silent confession. And, as the deputies led him away, the first rays of the morning sun breaking over the orchard in a blaze of light, Maggie turned back to her sons, to the laughter that would come in time, to the gentle work of rebuilding the family that had been stolen from them, and she felt the first true breath of hope in her chest, a soft, steady promise that, though the road ahead would be long, they would walk it together. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, washing the orchard and the farmhouse in soft gold and casting long shadows that seemed to whisper of the years they had lost, Maggie felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, fragile and new, like the first shoots of green pushing through the winter-hard earth. And though the air still tasted of dust and the quiet ache of memory, she could see in her son's eyes the beginnings of something brighter, the tentative glimmer of a future that had once seemed impossibly out of reach. And as she sat with them on the worn porch steps, the photograph of their 6-year-old faces resting between them like a bridge across the years, she listened as they spoke in low voices, sharing stories of the lives they had lived apart from her, the small, ordinary moments that had become extraordinary in their absence. And with every word, every shared laugh and quiet sigh, she felt the pieces of her heart begin to knit back together, not as they had been before, but stronger and fiercer for the love that had endured the long darkness. And George was there beside her, his hand resting gently on her back, his quiet strength a steady beat against the uncertainty of what lay ahead. And she leaned into him, drawing from the well of his calm as they watched their sons together, the way they stood shoulder to shoulder, their heads bent close in that silent language of brothers that even the years could not erase. And she thought of all the nights she had lain awake in the small hours, the weight of their absence pressing down on her chest like a stone. And now, to see them here, breathing and laughing and so achingly real, it felt like a miracle, a gift she would never take for granted. And as the day stretched on and the gentle hum of life in the orchard rose around them, she knew that there would be hard days still, days when the memories of what they had lost would rise up like ghosts in the corners of their minds. But she also knew that they would face them together, that the love she had carried like a candle in the darkness would be enough to light the way. And as she watched Lucas stand and turn to her, his eyes bright with something she could not name, he held out his hand, a silent invitation, and she rose, her fingers slipping into his, the warmth of his skin a quiet, steady promise that, though the past would always be a part of them, it would no longer define them. And as they stepped off the porch together, the orchard stretching out around them in a riot of green and gold, she felt the first true breath of the future fill her lungs, sweet and sharp, and filled with the fierce, unbreakable certainty that this was not the end of their story, but only the beginning. As the afternoon sun traced lazy arcs across the sky, and the gentle breeze stirred the branches of the orchard in soft whispers, Maggie found herself sitting at the small kitchen table of the farmhouse. The familiar creak of the old wooden chairs beneath her, and the warm scent of cinnamon and apples filling the air. And across from her, Lucas and Noah sat with their hands wrapped around steaming mugs of tea, their faces illuminated by the golden light that spilled through the windows like a blessing, and for a moment, the years seemed to slip away, leaving only the simple, quiet magic of a mother and her sons sharing a moment of peace. But beneath the calm, Maggie could feel the tension that pulsed just below the surface, the questions that still lingered in the spaces between their words, and she knew that the time had come to speak them aloud, to give voice to the fears and hopes that had been locked away for far too long. And so she took a breath, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup as she said softly, "Tell me everything, about how you lived, about who you became." And for a moment there was only silence, the kind that stretched between hearts and dared to be filled. And then Noah spoke, his voice low and steady as he spoke of the early years, the way Raymond had told them that their parents were gone, how he had woven stories of loss and new beginnings that had become the bedrock of their childhood. And Maggie listened, her heart aching with each word, but she did not look away, because these were the pieces of their story that had been stolen from her, and she would honor them all, no matter how much they hurt. And when Noah's voice faltered, Lucas picked up the thread, his words weaving a tapestry of small joys and quiet sorrows, of days spent working the fields and nights spent dreaming of a family they had been told would never come. And as he spoke, Maggie saw the flicker of pain in his eyes, the shadow of the boy he had been and the man he had become. And she reached across the table, her hand warm and sure as she said, "I'm here now, I'm here, and I will never leave you again." And though the tears that filled his eyes did not fall, she saw the way his shoulders eased, the quiet relief that settled around them like a balm, and for the first time in 30 years, she felt the fragile beginnings of forgiveness, for herself, for the years that had been stolen, for the man who had taken them, because she knew that forgiveness was not a gift for the one who had done wrong, but a promise to the ones who had survived, a vow to let the light of the present outshine the darkness of the past. And as the shadows lengthened and the quiet hum of the orchard filled the spaces between their words, Maggie knew that the hardest part was still to come. But she also knew that they would face it together, one breath, one heartbeat, one moment at a time. As dusk settled over the orchard, painting the sky in soft strokes of lavender and gold, Maggie stepped outside, her bare feet pressing into the cool grass as she breathed in the quiet of the evening, and behind her, the soft murmur of her sons' voices drifted through the open windows of the farmhouse, their laughter mingling with the low rustle of the trees. And she closed her eyes, letting the sound wrap around her like a benediction, because this was what she had longed for most. Not grand gestures or perfect answers, but the simple, quiet moments that made a family whole again. And as George stepped up beside her, his arm slipping around her waist, she leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder as they watched the first stars appear in the twilight sky. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, filled with the slow work of healing and the echoes of memories that would never fully fade, she felt the unshakable certainty that they had already begun to build something stronger than the pain, a home woven from laughter and forgiveness, and the fierce, unbreakable love that had carried them through the darkest nights. And when Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel stepped out onto the porch to join them, their silhouettes framed by the warm glow of the farmhouse lights, Maggie reached for them, her hands steady and sure, and in that quiet, sacred moment, she saw not the years they had lost, but the future they would build together, one filled with the gentle rhythm of mornings in the orchard, the shared stories of lives that had been both broken and made whole again, and the quiet, constant promise that no matter how far they had wandered, no matter how deep the shadows had grown, they had always been a family. And as the moon rose high above them, its light silvering the leaves and turning the night into something soft and luminous, Maggie closed her eyes and let the peace of that knowledge settle deep in her bones. A light that would never be extinguished, a testament to the power of a mother's love and the resilience of the human heart. And as she stood there with her family gathered close around her, the past finally laid to rest and the future bright with possibility, she whispered into the quiet night, "We're home." And in the silence that followed, she felt the truth of those words echo back to her, a quiet chorus that would carry them all into the dawn. As the final echoes of the orchard's whispers fade and the quiet of the night settles around them, a family once torn apart stands united once more. Their scars remain, etched deep into the story of their lives, but so too does the quiet promise of healing, a testament to the power of love that endures even the longest of separations. In the silver glow of the moon, they face a future still unknown, but this time, they face it together. Thank you for sharing this journey with us. If this story touched your heart or stirred memories of your own, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe for more tales of hope and resilience, and join our community of storytellers who believe that even the darkest night can give way to dawn.